down on prey, we're gaining ground. Glory, hallelujah, the dead's alive and the lost is found. Glory, hallelujah.
Hello and welcome to Eschatology Matters. My name is Jacob Toman and I serve as lead pastor at Ada Christian Reformed Church in Ada, Michigan. It is my pleasure to host today's discussion about why eschatology matters. For our discussion today, we're joined by Troy from Revived Thoughts to help us learn about the life, legacy, and eschatology of the 28th U.S. President, Woodrow Wilson. Troy is a part of a team of Christian historians and story sharers at Revived Thoughts. The team at Revived Thoughts retells the lives and impact of martyrs, missionaries, movements, and moments throughout church history. Without further ado, let's jump into today's discussion. Let me start off with our first question. Of course, thanks so much for joining us today, Troy. We're excited to have you here at Eschatology Matters. And the first question today is just, first off, we're talking about Woodrow Wilson and post-mill theology around the turn of the century and how that then played out throughout the 20th century and the impact of it. Talk to us a little bit about this in terms of how you got interested in this, because most of us didn't wake up today thinking, I wonder about Woodrow Wilson and his particular eschatological views and how that impacted the last 100 or so years of the globe. So talk to us a little bit about what intrigued you, what drew you into it, what sparked your curiosity on this?
Jacob, I want to push back on that. I think the average person cannot sleep at night without wondering, what was Woodrow Wilson's eschatology? It's eating at them, right? So I'm finally here to help you out.
Amen.
No, for me, I love church history, and we run a podcast called Revived Thoughts and Martyrs and Missionaries. Something we just have this passion. I've learned that just by studying the church and studying the amazing things God has done over the past 2,000 years, I've learned so much from doing it. And I've noticed that eschatology right now, if you spend a lot of time online, maybe in different circles, engaging with people, I feel like the trending eschatology right now is postmillennialism. I'm not super trendy. I'm not super good at engagement. So I feel like if I'm seeing it, then other people are probably noticing it's become very popular too. And the first thing I think of when I see stuff is just, there are some people they are the theologians and they immediately can start grinding out the Greek and they can start doing that and they are so good at that. But my brain always goes to history. I just go, okay, when was the last time we saw this? When have we seen this before? And so when I kind of just started doing research based on when was this eschatology popular before, Woodrow Wilson immediately comes to the front because he is the quintessential American president who was also a post-millennial. And he is the PhD having Christian, highly educated president, which is funny because you either don't know much about Woodrow Wilson at all. You're going, okay, who is this guy? I maybe sort of remember his name from history class, or you're hearing that and you're already screaming into your microphone and going, please don't associate Christianity with Woodrow Wilson because he was not a good man. He is certainly somebody you would not want to associate, and it would bother you and irk you if you're hearing that and going, "Whoa, wait, don't tie us to that," right? And I understand, I hear you. I don't like saying that one of the most outwardly Christian, quote unquote, people that we had as presidents was Woodrow Wilson. And yet we have to deal with the fact that when historians look at him, one of the first things they point to is he says he was a Christian. And throughout his speeches, throughout his time, he has this faith that at the very least he's outwardly showing. Now, I think there's an extreme amount of evidence that faith was at the very least checkered and quite possibly completely fraudulent. But if you're looking at it from a purely historical perspective, especially if you're a secular historian, you're going to look at Woodrow Wilson and go, look, to me, he looks like your guy.
Wow. Yeah, so that definitely is the hook. That's definitely got me hooked going, okay, so let's dive into the deep end of the history of Woodrow Wilson. For those who don't know, right, President of the United States around the time of the turn of the century, we're talking pre-World War II, doing a brief history update, pre-World War II, after the Civil War. There was like 100 years almost between those two major events. Okay, we're going in the way back time machine here today. We're with Mr. Whitaker in the imagination station, as it were, here today, right? We're going into that time frame that's between like your third, fourth, and fifth grade years where you're learning about the Civil War and potentially learning about World War II. You're hearing about the big bank crash and the destabilization of America pre-World War II and what's going on there. You're hearing about Reconstruction post-Civil War. And in the midst of all this, there's a President Roosevelt, and then there's going to be another one. And in the middle of it all, there's Woodrow Wilson and his post-mill eschatology coming out, like you said, in speeches and in policies and in politics. So talk to us a little bit about what that looks like. As you did the historical research, where were the spots where you saw this is clearly an aspect of Wilson's eschatological frameworks? Where was his Christianity on display? We've said maybe it's fraudulent, maybe it's not, maybe it's just simply flawed, but either way, whichever of those two things it potentially is, or on a spectrum where it is, regardless of that evaluation, where does this come through? Where do we actually do that deep historical research and come to find out where Woodrow Wilson stood on particular issues, and how did that influence his leadership?
Okay, so let me start from maybe a couple of spots. So for me, our show Revive Thoughts, we love to take this is what we do. We take sermons of the past and we bring them back to life. And one of the very first people we brought back to life a sermon by was called Blueprint for Living by B.B. Warfield. And I learned a lot about B.B. Warfield. I was like, man, this seems like a really wonderful man. And very shortly after doing the sermon on B.B. Warfield, we did a sermon on J. Gresham Machen. And we were so new. We were so unknown to church history that we did the entire episode calling him J. Gresham Machen. And boy, let me tell you, there were comments and people being like, great episode, wish you would have pronounced his name right. So that's how just completely... Yep. Yeah, that's just how new we were to it. But both of these guys are at Princeton Theological Seminary. And so we had a lot of respect for these people. Spurgeon called them the Princeton worthies. These are men that a lot of us respect. So it was kind of a mind-blowing thing to me when I suddenly realized years later that as I was doing research on different things, I noticed that there was this Woodrow Wilson element there, because Woodrow Wilson does not come from Princeton Theological Seminary, but he was the president of next door, Princeton University. And some people will try to say, well, those, they were different organizations and institutions. And yes, they were. However, they have crossover. For example, the guy that was the president of the university before Woodrow Wilson will go on to be the president of the seminary after Woodrow Wilson is leaving. So there's a very clear interconnectedness. Many of the professors at both institutions knew each other very well. And several of the people that worked at Princeton Theological Seminary, J. Gresham Machen, Gerhardus Voss, these people had interactions and were friends of Woodrow Wilson. J. Gresham Machen especially, his family had a very close connection. Woodrow Wilson's uncle was kind of protected by the Machen family years before when he came out as an evolutionist. Later on, J. Gresham Machen will go to some of Woodrow Wilson's professor lectures when he's at Johns Hopkins University. Like, these guys are friends. They would meet each other. They would have each other over. Gerhardus Voss, who would later teach Cornelius Van Til, he's close. These are people who know each other. These people are interlocked. So I looked and I was like, are there any times that the people of Princeton ever call out what Woodrow's doing? Like, do they ever say like, hey, we don't approve of some of these policies and things that you're doing? That was kind of what started me on this journey, because I was trying to figure out, how did these two sides work, where you have Woodrow Wilson out there being one of the big figureheads for the world, and he has a huge impact on history. And you have all these seminary professors that a lot of us still respect today. And from what I can tell, almost none of them said anything. I could not find any of them really calling out what Woodrow Wilson was doing. And maybe they just didn't want to. He was our former president. We don't want to go after him. I can totally respect that and understand why you might not do that, but we don't see it. And so I was like, okay, so from what I'm seeing is there's this outward Wilson. Is there an inward picture to him? And the answer was, that surprised me, yeah. Woodrow Wilson, I mean, there is account after account after account of people saying this guy was in church every Sunday. Even when he was at the Paris conference for World War I, doing the peace treaty stuff, he was there. He was going to church as every Sunday that he could. He had an inward reflective life. Like, we have access to some of his journals and stuff. And from what we can tell, the guy spent a lot of time reading his Bible. A general, basically, a story that kind of got out, a campaign story that was made out to make fun of Woodrow Wilson, had this idea where a general was looking for him in the White House and found him on his knees praying. And the idea was supposed to be, look, Woodrow Wilson's in so far over his head that he's begging God for help. And that was what they put it out there. But the average American heard that and were like, wow, we have a president who goes to his knees in prayer. And whether or not that story is true, that's the impression that Woodrow created, that the people around him saw. And if this guy was, and I said it like this in our episode when I did this deep dive on him, if this guy was an elder at your church, you would probably really like him. Like if this guy had just been a pastor or somebody who worked at your local church, you would have heard what he was saying. You would have heard his passion for God, and you would have thought, man, this guy is we're really blessed to have someone like him on our staff. He's got a passion for it. He's got his daily devos. He's doing well. He would be everything you would want to see in a Christian. He's got a good family background where he's been raised in this, so he knows all the answers. And yet somehow, despite the fact that his entire presidency was, we're going to change the world for Christ, we're going to bring the peace of Christ. When he brings America into World War I, he says, through this war, peace of nations is going to happen. We're going to see God's peace descend as Christians act like Christians and put an end to this war that we Christians created. He's doing all these things that look good. He's one of the most disastrous people that ever lived. And we are still living from the very horrible repercussions of his presidency. World War II, he managed to actually offend every single player that would go on to be in World War II. Both Japan, Italy, and Germany were personally offended by him while he was in office. How do we balance these two sides of this man, where he is both, on the one hand, one of the most disastrous people that has ever held office, and on the other hand, he looked on paper like he should have been perfect?
Wow. Well, that's an awesome answer to that question. It sounds like there's a lot of history, a lot of firsthand, really primary resources that are available for us to dive into. Like you said, journals, as well as friends' input and testimonies of others around him, as well as, of course, campaign stories, which, campaign stories throughout the centuries have always been, okay, how much of this is legit and how much of this is manufactured. That's always there. But wow, it sounds like there's a lot of primary resources that we can really dive into to get to take a look back. So what were some of the things that stood out to you, particularly about his either professional side of his faith, the profession aspect of his faith, not professional as in the way how he represented himself in the public realm in his profession, but rather how did his profession of his faith, maybe through his journals, maybe through his diaries, maybe through conversations and letters, what is it that comes through about Woodrow Wilson's faith and his profession of his faith, whether that's particularly to eschatological matters or just generally his faith in Christ? What is it that comes through as you do that historical research on him? You said we would like him as an elder. What are things that he valued? What are things that he believed? What are things that maybe folks in our audience would be able to resonate with? Because our faith is timeless. Our faith is something that carries on from one generation to the next. So what is it that's something that maybe we could relate to about what Woodrow would have espoused and believed that maybe we can also echo and affirm, even if, again, it's maybe fraudulent, it's maybe fragile, it's maybe fractured?
So there's a really interesting book, and I read portions of it, just again trying to get into the mindset that is Woodrow Wilson. What was he? At the age of 20, he wrote an essay or a short book called Christ's Army. And remember, what I'm about to read to you is coming from a 20-year-old man. So again, this is, an unrefined picture, but this is still, he's old enough to have some thoroughly thought out stuff. But he has this quote that I really think is interesting, where he basically tells you, in this life, in this war, that the entire book is pictured, every single person is a member of Christ's army. You are either a member of Christ's army or you are a member of Satan's army. And he was very emphatic. There is no neutral ground. So if I can read a quote from this book, I think it really kind of gives you both a picture of him, but it also kind of, let's read it. Here in the book, we see look, here it is. The battle would progress. The army of saints ever gains ground under divine generalship. Now slowly, now rapidly, driving before them with irresistible force the broken ranks of the enemy. And just a short bit later, he also said, there is no middle course. There is no neutrality. Each one must enlist with the followers of Christ or those of Satan.
Wow.
And I think of that, and if I'm like, look, if we were sitting in a Bible study and a 20-year-old man was like, hey, you know what? I've been writing this. Let me hear what you think. And he shared this thought. I mean, wouldn't most of us go, wow, this young man has really been studying and learning, right? We would go, yeah, amen. I agree. This idea of how we're all being guided by generals, and that either slowly or rapidly we see the world becoming Christ and the world of the devil getting slowly taken away. That was an essential cornerstone aspect of the way he viewed the world. And very important to him was the generals. He believed that throughout church history, there were certain men that were called to rise above, and especially pastors. He saw these are the real leaders, that they are either calling their congregation, sending them into battle to lead, or they are being weak and they are causing the battle to be lost. But he did not believe the battle would ever be permanently lost. He believed Christ's army would eventually win. At some point, the battle would come and win.
Wow. That talk about a post-mill hope. Wowee. Now the question is, as we always say, as Dr. Josh Howard is always want to say in these discussions, right? We don't want to get too far into the weeds. So shout out to Dr. Howard. So without getting too far into the weeds, because that's so often where differences and disagreements are going to be. I think, like you said, that's a great quote. That's a wonderful answer to the question, what would folks echo today? The weeds of that conversation are really actually what we're going to get into here with Wilson's life, with Wilson's practice, with Wilson's politics, with Wilson's policies, and then with the fallout of Wilson's leadership. The weeds there are, okay, what does it actually look like for God's people to wage God's war God's way? What does that actually look like? And therein lies the differences in denominational positions. Therein lies the differences in missionary endeavors. Therein lies the differences in between various traditions and strands within Christianity about how we actually go about serving the Lord in the midst of his kingdom call. So when you look at Woodrow Wilson, you see those words from a 20-year-old man, and then you think, my goodness, this is going to be a man who in time and space, using his own words, he must have seen himself as a man who was called to rise above and to lead a nation into a war against what he must have seen as a global evil at that point in time in World War I. But in many other ways, there were many other issues during Wilson's time. Talk to us a little bit about what that must have been like for him as he rides, or rather as he rises to an ascendancy in a political position that gives him a lot of responsibility of actually living out these Christian principles that he's displaying in an early age, and he's sharing in a Bible study around the table, and we're all thumping the table, clapping our hands, saying, yes, amen, Woodrow. You go after it, you follow, you sign up in the Lord's army, and then in a few years you go, wow, I voted for that guy and the world's at war.
Yeah, so it's amazing. So I would I would love to just take a minute to talk about his rise to power, because in and of itself, it's kind of a really unique story. And he basically was he became the president of Princeton. He was always a good speaker. People loved him. People who listened to him, there are quotes where I read quotes where people were saying, like, he's the best preacher of our century. And I'm like, this is, I mean, only 20 years after Charles Spurgeon died. This is while Alexander McLaren is still preaching. This is while B.B. Warfield is still preaching at the same school. I mean, this is during an era with a lot of wonderful preachers and men of God that we would respect. And there are at least some people saying Woodrow's the best of all of them. So this guy is very highly respected. He gets to the top of Princeton. He's there for a while. He doesn't like the school politics. He has either a stroke or some kind of medical disability that happens. And his doctors tell him, hey, you need to calm down, you need to get away from the stress. And so his idea of getting away from the stress is he goes over to the Democrat National, convention or whatever, and basically leans in and goes, hey, if you want somebody to run for president, I'm interested, but I won't run for vice president. You make me president or nothing. Now
that's what I call taking a step back. Just take a step back. All right, I'll take a step back. I don't want to do the VP. The VP is too busy. That's too much work.
Yeah,
I'll just be president or nothing. I'll take a step back.
And that tells you, I think just that entire conversation just gives you a lot of hint in the way this guy views himself. And he really, man, he loved John Calvin. When he puts together the League of Nations, which we'll talk about probably in a little bit, he wanted it to be centered in Geneva because he respected John Calvin. He saw John Calvin as the theologian, statesman, model like there was no other. And I think very much his life was like, I want to emulate and be a John Calvin. So he'd done the theologian gig at Princeton, and he was, I think, ready to go, okay, now it's time for me to step in and become the statesman. Now, the Democrat Party had hardly won any elections after the Civil War. They weren't doing very great. They had lost the 5 last elections in New Jersey for governor. And so they kind of basically had this idea of like, look, we're going to lose anyway. Why don't we try this outsider, this professor? He's very popular. Christians like him. Let's run him for governor. On the off chance he wins, he's a newbie to politics. We'll be able to control him. It'll be a win-win for us. And if we lose, we were going to probably lose anyway. He runs for election. He surprisingly wins because he's an outsider. He's seen as this guy no one expected. He's very smart. He's got a Southern charm to him because he's from the South, and people just loved him. And so they made him the governor. And as soon as he became the governor, he basically cut all the political machinations. He went after all the businesses. He went after all the mob kind of money of New Jersey and basically was like, thank you for making me governor. Now I'm going to destroy you. And that made him very popular as well. They were like, he really is a fighter. He's going after corruption. He is what he said he was. And that to people looked very good. As almost immediately thereafter, he'd only been governor for about 2 years. He's already running for president. And his presidency is very unique because he's going to run for president at the same time that a third party, Theodore Roosevelt, is running. And they have another Republican candidate. It's not Warren G. Harding, but I am forgetting. I think it's Rutherford B. Hayes. It's one of those early guys that you forget the name of. You're like Theodore Roosevelt, another guy, him. And I forgot who it was too. And in this election, we also have a socialist, Eugene Debs, running. He will get more votes in this election than any other socialist will ever get at any other time, getting 6% of the votes. The third party candidate will get more than the incumbent Republican president. Theodore Roosevelt will get 27% of the vote, as Republicans voted for Theodore, hoping to get rid of the Republican because they did not like him very much. And Woodrow Wilson will win the presidency for the first time, I believe, either since the Civil War, or he was the first Southern Democrat, at least, to win since the Civil War. So it was a very unexpected result. And if you take Theodore Roosevelt's votes and you add them, the third party vote, and you add them Republican, the Republican would have won. But that third party split caused Woodrow Wilson to end up winning. So this guy literally resigns from Princeton, becomes governor. 2 years later, he is the president of the United States. I mean, that on road. And if you're living with Woodrow Wilson, you're thinking I'm supposed to be the next John Calvin. You're thinking you're maybe sent by God to be one of his generals. I mean, look what just happened. The road was cleared almost providentially for you to be a leader unlike any other. And the only person I really feel like you can compare him to, and you really can make a very direct comparison between these two people, is Barack Obama. Both of these guys were very hardcore progressives. Both of these guys were outsider, quote unquote, people who were professors, who people thought were very intelligent, who thought they would be different. And I think both of them were very not maybe the best presidents and had a lot of policies that have harmed us to this day. Barack Obama is a kind of capstone to what was started by Woodrow Wilson. And so Woodrow Wilson becomes president, and immediately he brings back the federal income tax, which had been gone for 40 years. He creates the Federal Reserve, which, if you know a lot about how economics work, not good, not great, was not helpful to the world. He brings back segregation. Up until this point, the government was where if you were a black person in America, a lot of people wouldn't hire you, but the government almost always would. They would be open to allowing people to join. Once Woodrow Wilson takes over, that's no longer going to happen. He had already segregated Princeton while he was there. Princeton had always been open to people of any race to come. He came in and segregated it for the first time ever. And when he takes over the government, he repeats that segregation. Even the Navy, which had always withstood segregation because it's very difficult to segregate people on a boat, Woodrow Wilson made it happen. He demanded that segregation. He even on a boat, he found ways to basically say, make it happen. People on different floors, do what you have to do. White people are not to interact with black people. He was a hardcore eugenicist. We are talking of the highest order. We're talking friends of his would go on to help plan and run concentration camps in Germany level pro-eugenics. The idea that one race was above others, that this world is an evolution, and that in this struggle for who will be the fittest race, the one race will have to be above them all. Woodrow Wilson completely believed that was true. He saw it as an aspect of the evolution that he had subscribed to since he was younger. And he believed that absolutely white people were the top of that racial hierarchy, and that honestly everyone else was an undesirable that needed to be restrained. And whether it was through sterilization, whether it was through just keeping them out of polite society, he absolutely believed it was the government's job to do that. And not only that, he was an extremely, extremely racist person. His writings of his book on the Southern history included a section, he wrote his own history book of the South, and it included a section glorifying the Ku Klux Klan, basically making them be these knights that went around defending white people from black people. Now, the Ku Klux Klan had actually gone extinct in the 1870s. The North had pretty much wiped it out. But because of his image, a documentary called Birth of a Nation used his quotes and used his idea to create this romantic image of these knights parading around America. He heard about that. He screened it in the White House, made it so popular that many Americans went and watched it, and he actually caused the Ku Klux Klan to be reborn. When you see pictures of civil rights stuff, you see lynchings, you see Ku Klux Klan stuff, that's not from the 1870s. That's from Woodrow Wilson's reborn Ku Klux Klan that came from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s because of that documentary, because of what he had written about them. On top of that, you may be saying, is there even more? Yes, there's even more. He did immense harm another way to racial stuff through riots. There were lots of riots and attacks on people. People throughout America were going through these explosive racial riots where the city would come together and all this stuff would happen. And Woodrow Wilson did absolutely nothing to stop them. He took a hands-off approach. When the cities would burn because of a racial riot, Woodrow was not interested in fixing it. I think oftentimes because he kind of supported it in his own way. He wanted maybe people to be afraid. And so he was kind of okay with what was happening. At the very least, he never sent the National Guard in, hardly ever. He never got involved. And honestly, one of the most explosive racial rioting times in America's history, at least since the Civil War to that point, happened under his presidency, while he did next to nothing to stop it. As we continue, he also is responsible for just a numerous other things, almost impossible to get into all of them. And yet, throughout it all, he's telling everyone, I'm a Christian. He's telling everyone, I love Jesus. He's using Christ-like language in his speeches and sharing with the world how we have to love God. The Presbyterian Church put out this idea in 1910 as they were becoming more ecumenical, this idea that basically all the nations of the world needed to come together kind of in one religion, one ecumenical church that would be the final kingdom of God. And Woodrow Wilson really supported this. And when the World War I began, he saw this as the great opportunity for Christians to self-correct and bring world peace. He basically was like, if we can end this war correctly, no one will ever want to fight again. They really believed at the end of World War I that there was a chance World War I would see no other war ever occur because it was so bad, everyone would learn their lesson and the Christians would be allowed to take over.
Wow. Well, that is getting into the weeds of it. That's great, Troy. That's a great answer.
Sorry.
I mean, no, it really is. It's getting into the weeds, and it's showing, as we oftentimes do here at Eschatology Matters, we talk about why our eschatology matters, why our hope for the future impacts, and also how our hope for the future impacts the way how we live in the present. And depending on our roles, depending on our responsibilities, depending on the positions and the places that God has called us with the responsibilities that we have, then that has a major impact on those around us. What a tangled web we weave with the ways how we live and the ways how we represent Christ, whether, again, that's fractured, whether it's faulty, whether it's fraudulent, or whether it's faithful. There's a lot of different ways that we can represent Christ in all these different aspects and areas that he calls us to. Well, let me ask you this question on the topic specifically about eugenics. We've talked a little bit about racism, but also talk about eugenics a little bit. Eugenics at that point in time, specifically when it eventually morphs in Germany, just because that's an area where I have done some research myself, so I'm interested to hear how this kind of forms out on the American side of things. How do things get picked up on the American side of things, and where does this idea come from? You've mentioned evolutionary thought influencing guys like Machen, guys like Warfield, potentially, guys like Wilson. How does evolutionary thought eventually lead these guys to the position of eugenics, particularly towards maybe those who are differently abled, for those who are born with different handicaps, for those who are born with different abilities? How does that eventually, we know that eventually actually becomes a policy in Germany under Nazi rule to begin exterminating folks who are born with seemingly, in their words, different defects. How is it that took root here in the United States with people who we look back on and we say these are men who represented and wrote wonderful theological influential works? How does that jive? What do we do with that? And where does that come from? How did eugenics at that point in time morph, and how is it applied?
So for me, I didn't know just how much eugenics during this time period really was effective of things. And it was actually the first time I ever engaged in this conversation and started to learn more about it was Joel Berry, who is the like head editing manager at the Babylon Bee. Really interesting guy. He had come on my show. We talked about it. He basically walked me through how eugenics played this massive role. And one of the things he pointed out was Jim Crow laws were not implemented directly after Civil War. It wasn't until later when science came out and said white people and black people is basically two species that are different interacting and you don't want that. That was when the Jim Crow laws actually started to get enacted. That was when you saw people starting to separate. It was when science came out with this idea. Evolution from the very beginning, Charles Darwin said, look, there are different races. There's a reason why it's survival of the fittest, the struggle of the races is the subtitle of that work. So from the very get-go, he saw it. And in his book, he quotes things and says things like, look, we once thought, this is a literal paraphrase of a quote of his, we once thought the Ottoman Empire would be a great race, but look now how far they have fallen. It is laughable that they could ever compete with the white races now. I mean, the guy was extremely entrenched in this racial views. If I can go on as ever so slight bunny trail here, rabbit trail, whatever you call it. He actually used a specific group of people in South America that lived at the very tip of Patagonia and specifically called them out and basically was like, hey, that group of people, they will never know God. They are basically monkeys. They lived at the southern top of South America. They would cover themselves in oil to stay warm because they lived really close to Antarctica. That southern tip of South America is not that far from Antarctica. And they're in a very cold part of the world. They only wore loincloths. They covered themselves in oil to stay warm. And when Darwin passed through that area, he basically was like, if this isn't proof that these are animals, I don't know what I can do. Well, a man named Alan Gardner, a missionary, heard that he had said that and basically made it his life goal. He's like, if I'm going to get anywhere in my life, I'm going to get to that southern tip of Patagonia. I'm going to share the gospel with those specific people that Darwin discounted. He gets there. He actually does a terrible job. Their boats don't give them enough food. His entire party starves to death and dies. However, people hearing what happened to Alan Gardner come to that area, begin to sweep it in evangelism and in missionary work, and many of them come to Christ and change. They become a changed people by the work of God in their lives. And eventually, Charles Darwin, who is no friend of Christians, joins the Patagonia Mission Society and basically becomes a paying member, not because he suddenly has this heart for Jesus and missions, but basically it was his way of saying, I'm sorry, I was wrong. I told you those people were unable to be saved, but I was incorrect. They apparently are able to be civilized. They apparently are able to be like the rest of us. I just saw them. So his way of basically kind of apologizing to everybody was, I'm going to join the Patagonia Mission Society. I'll donate a member's fee to prove that I kind of had to eat my words on that. Eat crow. I got that wrong.
Yeah, I wonder if that was a bet. I wonder if that was a bet with somebody over dinner or something. Right? Yeah, I'll eat my hat if that ever
Absolutely.
happens. But it does show a little bit of a difference. Between a Darwinian approach to what it means to have a realized eschatology, that a realized eschatology for the Darwinian and for the humanist is to be more like me. Whereas for us as Christians, to have a realized eschatology, it's to actually become more like Christ. And so that's a fundamental difference in our eschatological views between the naturalist, between the humanist, between the unbeliever. What does it mean for us to become more like what we should be? And for the eugenicist, for the Darwinist, for the evolutionist, for the racist, it's you've got to be more like me. Whereas for us as Christians, right, our hope is to become more like him. Wow, what a difference there. Keep going with that rabbit trail, Troy. Sorry to jump in.
Sure. No, but yeah, that was just me. So that's just, I think, a really good example of just the difference of the worldview. People often think, okay, evolution is a science thing. No, it's from its very beginning. Its founding principles were these ideas of these different races going against each other. And many of the early proponents, whether it's one of the Huxleys, which would go on to be very influential in world politics and lead presidents of different eugenics federations, or whether it's Hitler and what he did in Germany, or whether it's what was happening in America, where in the South, many of these academic people were raising up and getting out there and saying, look, you are not the same. We need to pass laws. And they would say it just as plainly as, look, would you let your daughter come home and marry a monkey? In the same way, we can't let these races interact. And that sounds so gross to say. I promise I'm not saying it. It's these people who are supporting this. And they were the most educated, intelligent people in their world. One of them went to Africa, took a human that was living in a tribe, brought him back to New York City. They put him in a zoo after taking him to the World Fair and said, "Look, we have found the missing link." And for years, people looked at this person and they went, "Wow, amazing." They actually put a monkey in there with him so he'd hold them, and people would walk by and go, "Wow, look at him. It's a missing link. There's no denying it." Theodore Roosevelt went and visited this exhibition. Many famous celebrities would go and visit this exhibition. They would all go past this person who had been robbed from his tribe and go, "Wow, it's almost human. You can really see it." And there was a group of people that had basically protested it. Young Baptist churches in the area said, "Please let him out. We will pay for his house. We will pay for his food. We will take care of him. Let him out. He's a human." It took years and years. And for years, scientists scoffed, like, "He's not a human. You backwards Christians living in the past. He's no human. He's clearly a missing link." But eventually, they did let him out, and they did let the churches take care of him. The churches tried to bring him back to his tribe, but at that point, a lot of his people had died and moved on, etc. He actually died very tragically, kind of in between worlds, having this, trauma of having been treated as a zoo animal hanging over his head. And it's just another one of those examples, though. And this was something I learned while studying Woodrow Wilson, and just something I feel like I've come to the conclusion of. There were a lot of very educated, very intelligent people telling you this is the way. This is the future. And to not be on board with this, you're living in the past. And it was Christians who stepped out and said, "You're wrong. These people are made in the image of God. You are incorrect in the way you are treating them. And that this eugenics movement is full of sin. And this is not how God wants to treat them." They were scoffed at. They were laughed at. They were mocked. And now 100 years later, we know, of course, they were correct. And hardly anyone remembers that it even happened at all. If they do, they certainly often don't know that it was the Christians who behind it said, this was sinful, this was wrong. We don't even hardly know the names of these people that did it, but there were many of them who stood up to this. This is the kind of eugenics movement that Woodrow Wilson is supporting. And something else I kind of noticed by studying it, during this same era, there's a group that will come about called the fundamentalists. And my whole life, whether I was at Bible college, seminary, wherever I was, I heard that the fundamentalists were kind of a bad group because they isolated themselves from the world. They built these Bible colleges. They kind of built their own church networks. They pulled themselves back from the rest of the world because they quit engaging in higher learning. For so long, I was like, yeah, we don't want to do that. But this episode, working through Woodrow Wilson, made me have another light for them. And I saw, you know what? The entire academic world was telling them that humans are lesser because of their race. The entire academic world was telling them eugenics, evolution, these things are the future. And these people reacted by saying, "You're wrong, and we're going to build our own institutions away from you because we're not getting anywhere in higher learning. We don't want to be associated with you any longer. You people of higher learning you Woodrow Wilsons of the world are ruining Christian reputations, and we want to try something new." And it made me kind of appreciate these fundamentalists didn't just suddenly wake up one day hating books. They looked at all the high, elite, educated people and looked around them and said, "How can you be so smart yet be so wrong?
Although
we're going to try something new."
That is their caricature, right, Troy? I'm going to interrupt you just for a minute. That is the caricature.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? That out of a whole movement, it's just, well, you hate books, and folks get memed on as though they're Luddites, right? That they hate all things that are potentially technologically relevant. Yeah.
And it might be true that there probably were some of them that were like that, and that might be what the fundamentalists eventually became. But I really appreciated, if I was living in 1917, if I had to make a choice and I saw one group going, "We're going back to the Bible, we just don't trust the rest of you," and I saw these higher elites going, "Look at this person we captured in a zoo, he's a missing link," I think I'd be tempted to join the fundamentalists too and go, "Look at this. I don't know what they're doing over there, but I want to get back to the Bible, people." And I can definitely see now with a new light and a new appreciation why so many people were skeptical of these academic institutions, which brings me back to my original point. Princeton Theological Seminary, you're sitting right there. Woodrow Wilson came from your world. And where are the critiques? Where are the challenges? Where were the Christians who stood up and said, "Look, he may have come from us, but we don't support that"? And very sadly, maybe they're out there. I don't have access to every research journal in the world, but I could not find it readily. It certainly was not something, after many hours of reading through their writings, it wasn't easily available. And that I looked at that and I go, man, that's concerning. When Christians needed to be leaders and say something, they were silent from what I can tell, or even they were supportive of it.
Or maybe here's the other aspect of doing history that Troy, right? Doing good historiography. Sometimes they were silenced, and we just don't have evidence of surviving
That's true
evidence
too.
of what the pushback was. And so sometimes we're going to be faithful witnesses by God's grace. God preserved the account of Jeremiah staying and being faithful and speaking out against the evil that was going on. That's a historical record, an inspired historical record of the evil of his day and speaking out against it and calling people to repentance. And we've got that historical record by God's grace, preserving his word and inspiring his word. But not everybody throughout all of history is going to have that equal amount of evidence left behind. But we do have a testimony before God that he knows, and God sees whether or not we're being faithful. And that's applicatory to us, especially here at EM, as we have different eschatological conversations, recognizing that there are massive, massive implications, again, not only for us, but for our people, for our communities around us, for our neighborhoods, for our families, and then for generations to come. The thought that comes to my mind, Troy, as you're saying all this about 1917, I've got a member in my church. I'm a pastor here in Western Michigan. I've got a member in my church who's 105 years old. So that means that she was around right at the end of World War II. That's the world that she's born into. And so this is not a world where everybody who could potentially listen to this discussion today is gone from their parents or even their grandparents growing up, reading the sorts of arguments that are being put out by eugenicists. And again, I always try to emphasize this when we're talking about eugenics. So often, eugenics is baby thrown out with the bathwater, and it's lumped in with the Nazis, and it's only the Nazis who practiced eugenicism. I mean, what I hope our audience is hearing clearly today is that our eschatology really matters, and that eschatology has mattered across the globe throughout the centuries, and at least by my way of application here with my 105-year-old member, it's not that long ago. It really is not that long ago. And so if we don't know our history, boy, we're just walking right back into it again. So this is very, very helpful, I think, for us, again, particularly on eschatological discussions, because there are many of us who might agree in the terms and the theological terms and descriptions of our eschatological hope of Christ's return and the timeline of Christ's return, and ultimately what that's going to look like, whether that's in the final accounting of things in the opening up of the book of life, or whether that's in the timeline of how bad things get before Christ returns. Either way, our discussions, even with other brothers and sisters in the faith who share the same eschatological framework that we do, we may actually have very, very, very different approaches and hopes in how we're going to get to that final chapter. That is very much coming through in all of these stories that you're sharing today. Well, Troy, I want to wrap up with a couple of questions here. I want to ask you one question. Let's pretend, Troy, knowing all that you know, you're now in 1917, and you're a member of a church, and you sit next to Voss, Warfield, you sit next to Woodrow Wilson. Okay? You know that you share some of the faith. You said Woodrow was very, very faithful in attending church. So you share a pew, you share a seat, you share an opportunity to shake this person's hand. Maybe you're at a Bible study and 20 years ago you heard him share about being in the Lord's army or in Satan's army. What do you say as you challenge him on some of these different topics? How do you encourage him in his study of the scriptures, but how do you discourage him in some of the applications and interpretations that he's taking away from it? How do you work through that as you're making a disciple there, Troy?
Sure. Well, for starters, I would say let's imagine I'm sitting across from Woodrow Wilson specifically. Around this time period, he had been kind of caught cheating on his wife. So I'd say, hey, Woodrow, look, that was bad. Repent of that. Let's get that out of the way. And now we've moved past that part of his life. I would look at him and say, hey, I think because based on where the trajectory he's going, I would say you have put your hope too much in this material world and in seeing material reflections, and you would put too much of your hope in your personal work, what you are going to do. In 1919, when he arrives at the Paris Treaty Conference to bring about the world, he is obsessed and almost like Ahab with Moby Dick, possessed by the idea of a covenant of a League of Nations, which he will eventually get, and American people will reject. It will break him. And yet he is convinced that if he can get this one object, he will bring world peace to the world. He believed that if all the treaties of the world had brought an end to world peace, and he believed a covenant of a League of Nations, of Christian nations working together, calling each other out on their sins, would bring them all back. He believed that disarming and all these things would lead to eventual world peace. And I would look at him and I would say, Woodrow, that is not your work to do. That is Christ's work to do on this earth. You are one man who is president of the United States, who is your job is to reflect Christ from your position. It is not your job to bring about world peace. It is not your job to carry this position over. And you, my friend, are just one man. You are not this ideal statesman theologian. And I would also challenge him and say a lot of the problems with his ideas came from the fact that he had philosophy and theological, maybe even good points to make, but he lacked any practical, pragmatic ways to bring these lofty ideas into the real world. He had this idea, this concept of a League of Nations, but he had no real plan for how this League of Nations would actually fix the world. He had a plan that the League of Nations would, but not in how it would do that. And I would encourage, and I would say this to many Christians today. Oftentimes we have an eschatology, and we have these ideas on what the world will bring. And I said this in my episode to the postmillennials. To the postmillennials, you have these ideas that the world is going to be conquered by Christ and everything, we're going to see his kingdom enter into reality now. I hope you are correct. I personally am not a post-millennial, but man, it would be nice if you were right. I'm more on the, I'm a little bit more on the doomsaying. Don't think it's going to be as good. But if you are correct, that's wonderful. How do you bring this out of the theoretical and begin to apply it to your neighbors around you? Although your neighbors need to hear your hope and need to hear your encouragement, they also need to hear and see your actual actions. And they need to feel that hope. If you're telling me, hey, we're going to transform this world for Christ, man, that's awesome. Do it. Like, I want to see it. I want to hear some of your plans. I hear many people say, "Oh, we're gonna change politics." Well, what's your campaign? What's your plan? What's your strategy? Who are you sending? Where are the super PACs? Like, what are we gonna do to actually commit these things, taking them out of the lofty theological world and actually throw them into the world above? Because you know what? I may not agree with you on everything eschatology, but I would be happy to donate some dollars and maybe even not. I can't knock on houses. I'm in Indonesia, but I'd love to be a part of what you're doing and bringing this into the real world and actually applying it. Woodrow Wilson had all the lofty theological ideas up there, but when it came to applying and living around the world he was in, he could not do it. And I think there are a lot of us who are really struggling with these eschatological ideas that are floating around in our head. But when it comes to talking to people, sharing Christ, and actually interacting with those around us, we are failing to do that part well. And I'm telling you, if it's true, we need to take our hope and actually apply it to the real world. It can't just stay ideas and conversations. It needs to start becoming actions too.
Yeah, amen. And institutions are occupied by people, right? Some of the post-mill preoccupation or overrealization is a dependency on, or maybe it's a proper view of the influence of institutions. I don't know. Maybe I'm being too strong there to say an overdependency, but it's a recognition of working through institutions. But working through institutions are made up of people. And those individual people inside those institutions will make vastly different decisions depending on who their trust is placed in their own work, like you said. Like maybe you'd confront Woodrow Wilson. You're putting too much of an emphasis on your work there, Woodrow, rather than on what Christ's work has accomplished and what he's promised to accomplish in the eschaton and for all of eternity for his remnant people. That's the good news. So institutions change even as people change. And so what are we aiming at? That's a great challenge and a great question and a great answer about how you disciple Woodrow Wilson if he was sitting across the table from you. That's a great point. It's amazing to see the tangled web that sin weaves whenever we're studying historical figures. And you can see how there's one or two things that seemingly happen. You've mentioned the stroke and how that stroke brought about advice from a doctor, and then how that doctor then said, hey, take a step back. And so then that leads to his presidential campaign eventually. But you've also mentioned about just his racism, his view of humanity, his view of those who also are equal image bearers, and then even his view of his spouse, and whether or not his spouse is truly his covenant ally, or whether or not it's just somebody there for his own pleasure and for his own purposes. I mean, we just see what a tangled web sin can weave in our lives, and what a legacy it can leave. But thankfully, God's grace is even greater than all of our sin. Well, give us some hope here, Troy. What are some things that are some of the fallouts? What are some of the fallouts, right? So we can get into some of the dirt. Again, you've mentioned a lot of it here today, but as we wrap up, what are some of the aspects of the fallout from Woodrow Wilson? And then maybe get a little bit hypothetical with us, or just practical, as you've observed. What are some ways that Christians have corrected for some of these things that have gone on in the midst of the legacy of Woodrow Wilson, the tangled web that is the Woodrow Wilson legacy?
Sure. Let me try and hit all those. For starters, for Woodrow Wilson, and I'm kind of giving you a summarized thing. We, on our own show, Revive Thoughts, we put out a part 1 and a part 2. If you're listening to this and you're thinking, wow, you're really in the weeds, well, it might not be for you then, because there's a lot more quotes and stories. We get a little bit even more in the weeds. It was like 2.5 hours of me recording in a hot, humid room in Indonesia talking about Woodrow Wilson. I got to the end of that, and I thought, is anybody going to want to listen to this episode on a guy who lived 100 years ago?
The answer is yes. At least for me and for my family, I'm going through this and I'm going, okay, I know what I'm going to listen to. I'm going to preview it, and I'm going to see what's available even to teach my kids as they grow up, because they need to know their history as well, and the history of the world, and the impact of our theology and the impact of our study of God's Word. It really does potentially shape the world and influence those around us. So I thank you for your work on that. But give us some of the highlights and some of the dirt and some of the ways we've tried to correct.
Yeah. So let me just finish it. So I mentioned before, he managed to tick off all 3 of the people that America would go into World War II with. Well, when he was at the Peace Treaty Conference, he was so obsessed with the League of Nations that even though he had said, if we punish Germany for World War I, Germany will want to get revenge in another time for this. He compromised and said, fine, punish Germany, make them pay reparations as long as I get my League of Nations. Germany was very upset about that. Everyone would agree. The Treaty of Versailles almost directly leads to the rise of the Nazi Party, leads to Germany becoming what Germany becomes in World War II, because the Allies were so dead set on punishing them. And the thing is, I can understand why Britain and France would be mad at Germany. They lost a lot of people. They lost a lot of money. They were very hurt. What is upsetting is Woodrow Wilson knew better, but he compromised on that to get his Covenant of League of Nations idea that he thought would bring about world peace. But most people don't know that he also managed to offend the Italians. He had been compromising on so many things for the League of Nations that he realized people were realizing, if we want something for Woodrow, all we have to do is say, we'll come out, we won't support the League of Nations. So if Britain's like, hey, I want this colony in the Middle East, he's like, I don't know if we deserve it. All they had to say is, we're not sure if we can do the League of Nations. He'd be like, you can have that colony in the Middle East, right? Like, he'd give them whatever they wanted. So the Italians kind of were like, we want Austria. And Woodrow put his foot down. He's like, no, okay, you can't do that. I'm like, we won't go with the League of Nations. He's like, I got this. He writes a letter. He pulls out his typewriter. He writes a letter, basically, Dear Italy, I know that you will do the right thing by joining the League of Nations. I know that as Christian brothers, you would not be so foolish as to not join. It writes this very letter and sends it to the people of Italy. The people of Italy are massively offended. And they're like, who is this condescending guy who thinks he's basically Jesus to tell us that we're not righteous? And they became extremely annoyed, broke down relationship there with Italy and America. They were very much on not speaking terms after that letter. And the third group, Japan, they had also showed up. They had fought for the Allies in World War I, and they came to Woodrow and they said, Woodrow, we love your League of Nations. We love it. We're a big fan. All we ask is, could we get an amendment that says everyone is treated equal, that regardless of race, all are equal? And Woodrow, being a hardcore eugenicist, kind of, No, I don't think I see that going into my League of Nations. He used every lever he had on the committee to reject that from being a part of it. And the Japanese were so embarrassed, were so frustrated. They went back to Japan, and on the Wikipedia article, it'll just tell you this was considered like an inciting event that helped lead Japan down the road of becoming Imperial Japan, where they realized the West was never going to treat them as equals. They realized the West was never going to see them as on par with them. So they said, well, why bother trying? The more extreme elements use this as a part of their campaign to move Japan in a more extreme direction. And eventually Japan would become the imperial army that, caused untold amounts of loss of life, damage, and trouble across Asia. And millions of people died by that empire. And one of the inciting events was we have this man. He's claiming, this outward Christianity, yet because he has lost his focus, he is creating the very enemies that America will see in World War II. He will get his League of Nations. He'll go back to America. America herself will reject the League of Nations. They will say, we see that as an entangling alliance. We don't want it. He will travel the country to try to get everyone on his side. And he will have a second stroke. He'll completely break down for a year. He'll live as a president, but it seems like his wife actually might have been the real president behind the scenes. There's some very iffy stuff that went on there where he seemed very much incapacitated, and eventually he will live long enough to see that the person that runs for president after him promises to bring the League of Nations into place. Warren G. Harding, who's running after him, says, I promise to return America back to normal and not do the League of Nations. And Warren G. Harding will win a resounding victory of over 60% of the voters saying, we want things to go back to normal, no League of Nations. And Woodrow will live long enough to see that. But even as late as 1923 or 24, his last speech is only 15 minutes long. He's not ever fully recovered from a stroke, but he's still convinced God is going to bring the League of Nations. You'll see, America will be in it. You'll see League of Nations. America never does join the League of Nations. The League of Nations dissolves. It completely fails. When Japan invades China, everyone votes, don't do that, Japan, and Japan just goes, okay, and leaves the League of Nations. Later on, Italy will invade Ethiopia, and the League of Nations will all vote, don't do that, Italy. And again, Italy will just be kind of like, well, what are you going to do? And when World War II begins, the League of Nations does dissolve. However, we do get that the League of Nations does eventually become the United Nations. But I don't know if that's really a net positive per se, but it does become the blueprint for another institution that is still here to this day. Now, what do we do with this legacy of Woodrow Wilson and these people? For the starters, for the most part, we should know it. So many of us have just forgotten this huge window of our lives and our history that we're not even aware that there was this sides of it. I think it's also just important to live with a little bit of a warning that, look, just because people are academics, just because people are elitists, just because people are very intelligent does not always mean that everything they say is good. The most highly educated people, the most highly educated president the United States ever had, Woodrow Wilson, was a very damaging man to both the cause of America and the cause of Christianity, I think, around the world. Christians did correct itself, though. Over time, Christians who stood up and said over and over again, humans are equal. They agreed with Japan on this. Humans are equal. We're made in the image of God. Over time, Christianity won that battle. And over time, science moved away from that direction. The eugenicists, especially after World War II, lost a lot of their luster. They didn't completely lose. Planned Parenthood was founded by a eugenicist and is still going strong to this day. Yet we see that overall Christianity did recenter itself, and many of those beliefs are no longer held by anybody to this day, and that is a big victory for the world. If I can leave us with anything, I think Woodrow Wilson is an excellent example of a cautionary tale where when you get off track of what Christ is calling you to do and you begin to take on the role of, I am going to do this great thing for Christ, I am the focus, although you may be very intelligent, and although you may have wonderful people Woodrow Wilson loved the Puritans, loved John Calvin. He had all of the things you would want him to have. And as far as we can tell, yes, he did probably cheat on his wife, but he also he was reading his Bible, he was attending church. So many things that you would think on paper look good. He lost that focus on what matters most. He got his eyes off Christ and got his eyes on himself. I think there's a cautionary tale for us that as we are living for Christ, eschatology absolutely matters, but we must also remind ourselves that it is not our job to do what it is Christ's job to do. Christ has his job. We have what we are called to do in our own spaces. And if you make it to the presidency, you will have a very big space you are to work on, but there are still boundaries and limitations you're still the president. You're not God. And Woodrow seemed to have lost that perspective over time, and the whole world suffered for what Wilson lost. Now, if you don't mind, you're looking for hope. I'm looking for hope too. Can I tell you a story of another man? I end my episodes on Woodrow Wilson on this, but I want to tell you a story of another man, another president that I think he did a better job of living for Christ, or at least leaving us a Christ-like example. Even though he wasn't the PhD having guy, I don't know what his eschatology was, but I love this guy named James McKinley. I'd never heard of him. I don't know his politics. And if you're going to send me like an email and be like, actually, James McKinley did all, I don't know. I'm not a McKinleyist. I'm not bringing him back. Okay. But he has this moment where the Philippines fell into his lap. And I had a person who's from the Philippines after this episode go, hey, Like, look, not everything he did was good, and I totally understand that. I'm not saying we need to recolonize the Philippines or anything like that. But he at least he had the Philippines fall into his lap after the Spanish American War. He didn't know what to do with it. He prayed about it. He said he told some Methodist ministers that he brought to his White House. He said, "Look, I don't know if what we're supposed to do here. I'm going to keep the Philippines, though, because we have an opportunity to now send missionaries to the Philippines because it's ours. And if we can get America on board with trying to send people to the Philippines to share Christ, let's make that our goal." And I love the perspective of this guy because I go, yes, I think that's the perspective we often need to have. Woodrow had theories. Woodrow had philosophies. Woodrow had this organization, the system in his head, and he lost the simple sharing of the gospel. James McKinley, I would probably argue, not as educated, not as, maybe not as great a speaker. I don't know much about him, but he had this simple vision where he goes, I have a colony. I don't really want this colony, but if we send Christian missionaries there, people will hear the gospel, and that will make all the difference. And I think that is so often what we lose track of. We create all these systems and things, when in reality, what we're called to do is look around us, go to the people around us, maybe go far away, some of us, and go share the gospel with those around us and say, hey, this is what we need to do, and let the gospel do its transformational work that it will do all on its own without us having to say or do anything. When James McKinley gets assassinated, because he does get assassinated, I believe by an anarchist, while he gets shot or stabbed, I wish I could remember exactly, the Secret Service tackled the guy, and James McKinley goes, hey, don't rough him up too bad, boys. Don't be too harsh on him. All right, come on now. As he's dying, he goes to the hospital. He's going out, and some of his final things are just him singing a hymn to God and just loving the Lord all the way through. And I go, man, that's the kind of presidents we need. People who are not so caught up in their own lofty theological thoughts, but just men and women who love Jesus simply and just recognize, hey, even the guy who's assassinating me, I want him to hear the gospel one more time if we can. Don't rough him up too much, boys. Let's give him one more chance, right? That is such a better example of what a president should be, and what a better example of, I think, who we are supposed to be as people than the Woodrow Wilson. I'm obsessed. I've got all these theories. I've got all these things, but in reality, they're hurting people.
Yeah, well said. That's a wonderful hope that you give to us, Troy. And let me encourage our audience as well to follow up on your devotional with that. Of course, folks can give a follow and folks can listen to these extended episodes. We did not get into all the weeds, so there's more weeds to get into about Woodrow Wilson, about post-mill eschatology. There's more stories, more quotes, more history for us to learn. But let me also leave us with this encouragement. Not only are our presidents called to live with this simple faith in who Jesus is and why he matters and what he's promised to do, but also moms and dads and boys and girls and pastors and workers and co-workers and friends and farmers and engineers. We too, we're called to this simple faith in who Christ Jesus is and what he's done and why all of that matters. So thank you so much, Troy, for giving us your time today, for joining us at a crazy hour in the night, all the way on the other side of the world. So it's wonderful to have you join us today for our Eschatology Matters discussion. And I hope we can do it again soon, and you can teach us more about some other awesome findings that you find as you study and learn more about why history matters, and then come tell us about how history has mattered throughout history as you study eschatology as well. We'd love to have more conversations.
Oh man, I'd be happy to do it. You call me at any time of night. You want to talk about some old person that lived and how their stuff. I am all about it. This is my passion. I love doing it. I love sharing stories like this. And when I found people who want to hear about Woodrow Wilson's eschatology, I was like, these are my people. I can't wait, and I hope they don't mind if I ramble a bit.
There you go. Didn't ramble at all, and we've benefited from it much. Thanks so much, Troy.
Seated here at my right hand, the Lord to my Lord did command, for of these heathen I will make a kingly footstool for your sake.